Hello everyone, this is part 10 of What If Naruto Was Abused and Leaves Konoha, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Naruto looked around in wonder and awe. He had never seen so many people gathered around in one place before. The stadium was massive, yet he never even recollected seeing it before now. Even when he was smaller, he thought he would recognize such an enormous building. The stands were filled to the brim with people, all of whom were talking amongst one another, taking bets on the upcoming fights or simply waiting in unconcealed anticipation. The arena itself was equally impressive in size, if a little dull and plain for his taste. There were a few trees off to one side, but other than that not much else. Even some kind of water feature would be nice. Not everybody was like the Nadaime Hokage and could create suitin techniques out of thin air. He looked around for anything that might be advantageous as the last of the spectators filed into their seats. The massive open areas would suit his fighting style well, but he could also say the same thing about the boy standing confidently across from him. Any sized area was suited to Neji's close-range combat style. It was just unfortunate that Naruto didn't have many long-range attacks. It irritated him to no end that he had a jutsu that could finish this fight in no time at all, but he knew it would be extreme overkill to use. He shrugged to himself passively. If he was really struggling, he would just use it anyway. Naruto calmly awaited the initiation of the fight while simultaneously weighing up his opponent. He had plenty of chances to train over the month-long period every fighter had been given, and he had used them to the fullest. He cursed the damn Hyuga's fighting style. It was in direct contrast to his more heavy-handed attacks. Getting in close and personal with this guy would be bad for him. He had planned accordingly, but it didn't mean he had to like it. He looked up to where the Hokage sat in his personal box and smiled, before he noticed the conspicuously unoccupied chair to his left. His thoughts turned sour as he thought about Gaara and his father's murderer, causing his hands to subconsciously clench into fists. He quickly stopped that, not wanting to give the impression the waiting was getting to him. He thought instead about Tayuya, how after the incident with Jiraiya everything had returned to some semblance of normalcy between them. She had been a huge help in his training, having nothing to train for herself but keeping her skills sharp all the same. However, all the times when he would be winning only for her to pull out that accursed flute really got to him. Sometimes he wished he had never bought the offending object in the first place, discounting all the times it had come in handy on missions. One day he was really going to have to come up with a solution for that so his enemies couldn't take advantage of it. Suddenly he was violently brought out of his own personal monologue by the start of the match. He quickly noticed the very focused-looking Hyuga running towards him, and on pure reflex he sent chakra to his feet and used it to launch himself over the other boy's head. He hadn't expected the fight to start so soon, but at least he had ticked off jumping ability on his little tune and tick list. He was under no illusions here. The objective was not to win but to showcase his abilities. He brought up the list in his mind, and at the very top of it were close-range combat skills. He groaned at the thought, but nevertheless he rooted his feet to the ground and awaited the next charge of the pale-eyed boy. Neji got close and began lashing out with his deadly and incapacitating blows. Naruto's eyes widened when one stray blow for the Hyuga's outstretched fingers managed to brush his arm. He was shocked because despite knowing that it had hit him, he felt nothing from the contact. He rushed back from the encounter, looking at the spot where a small red dot had appeared, signifying the loss of a tenketsu. He cursed the Hyuga again. He didn't know the blows were also anesthetized. That would be a pain if he didn't even realize he was being hit. Once again he found himself in close proximity with the Hyuga, dodging for all he was worth the lightning-fast attacks. It was really just a good thing that Naruto was faster, or so he thought at least. He had looked up from his arm a little late to see Neji already striking out at his body again and again. It was too fast and too sudden for Naruto to counter, as he felt more and more of his chakra being sealed off. The violent and sudden attack finally let off and he was allowed to slump to his knees, his body currently useless from the neck down. He might have been scared right now if he didn't know about this ability beforehand. As it was, he was in fact prepared and, like promised, Kyuubi's chakra quickly flooded his body, forcing open the closed junctions in his chakra network. It was only enough to do exactly that, no use alerting every high-leveled shinobi in Konoha with the foreign chakra. He smirked as he stood up, mostly because of Neji's disbelieving face as he looked at the boy who should have had difficulty breathing right now, never mind standing up. Naruto used that hesitation to rush in and get a few solid blows to Neji's midsection before years of instinctive training kicked in and the Juoken attacks came back in full force. Despite Neji's newfound wariness concerning his opponent and his impossible abilities, Naruto found himself in the exact same situation as before. All he could do was dodge the annoying fingers, unable to counter or retaliate, as he would have liked, especially now that his tenketsu could no longer be reopened. After a while, which he could tell by Neji's increasingly frustrated appearance, Naruto finally backed away from the close quarters confrontation. He figured that dodging Juoken blows for that long would be enough to get him a decent score in taijutsu. Next up came his favorite. He jumped back into the center of the arena while Neji watched on, wary of what his opponent was attempting to do. Naruto quickly molded the required chakra and went through the hand seals as quickly as he could without making a mistake. Wind style, rotating sides jutsu. As soon as he said it, his body slanted at an awkward angle to the ground and he started windmilling his arms wildly like he was about to fall over. Neji thought that was exactly what was happening, believing his opponent had screwed up the jutsu. He began to run at Naruto, confident about taking advantage of his enemy's blunder before he could right himself. Naruto just smirked as his clenched fists opened up, his fingers outstretched like blades. Everybody in the arena watched on, intrigued as the wind began to pick up when Naruto's arms sliced through the air. There were a few gasps as the air at the very edges of his pointed hands became white, forming a perfect circle that grew into a wheel of razor-sharp air. There were even more gasps as the spinning scythe launched out from Naruto, directly at Neji. The running Hyuga dodged to the side just in time to avoid the spinning wheel of air, only to see it dig a vicious gash into the solid stone wall behind him. Naruto wasn't done yet though. Quicker than before, another wheel began forming and was quickly launched from his position. Once again Neji was forced to dodge as the even faster wind scythe span past him, grazing his sleeve by a few centimeters. Naruto kept this up, launching one after the other at the Hyuga, who was unable to do anything but dodge the dangerous jutsu until finally he became overwhelmed and activated his ultimate defense. Rotation. The sphere of blue energy erupted into life as Neji span around, releasing the required chakra from his own tenketsu. He smirked as the blade he had been unable to dodge approached, clearly being able to see the chakra-infused wind with his Byakugan. The smirk vanished when he noticed the blade of air neatly slice right past his normally impenetrable bubble, only some of the chakra being lost. He was hit full in the chest. The only thing saving him from a rather unpleasant end was the amount of chakra that had been drained from the attack by his defense. Even so, he now had a thin line up his chest where the spinning wheel met his body. Luckily for him, Naruto couldn't maintain the jutsu any longer, coming to a stop on his knee with one fist on the ground. That jutsu always left him a little dizzy. Perhaps after this fight he could ask how Neji managed it with his own spinning technique, since he didn't appear dizzy at all. He warily got up, noticing his opponent do the same, now sporting a thin cut through his shirt, which was slowly being stained red. It was hardly life-threatening, but if the fight continued on, then it would work in Naruto's favor. Hopefully it would at least slow the Hyuga prodigy down enough for what Naruto had planned next. He formed a now very familiar one-handed seal and instantly 4 more of him appeared, 2 on either side. He hoped that a one-handed shadow clone jutsu would earn him some points in the judge's book, but he couldn't focus on that now. He sent his clones off to attack Neji and they quickly surrounded him, approaching slowly as Neji looked around him. His Byakugan was confused by the situation. He had no idea which of the clones was the real Naruto. Each one had identical chakra and there was nothing else they were formed from. He was even more surprised when one lashed out and he felt the air from the attack move over his now bent-over body. It was quickly followed by a tandem attack from the clone opposite, which felt equally real. Neji didn't know how that was even possible. He had heard of clones with solidity but none that were made out of seemingly nothing. He suddenly treated each one as a potential threat as he blocked, parried or dodged their perfectly in time attacks that left him just on guard but not fully open. He could feel them holding back for some reason and decided to take advantage of that. In a moment of respite after one clone had finished his attack and another was just beginning, he lashed out with his foot and caught the third clone square in the chest. His eyes opened a little wider when it simply burst into smoke, causing him to cough slightly. He turned to face down his now reduced opponents only for them to burst into smoke as well. He furrowed his brow, wondering at the strange tactic as he tried to waft some of the smoke away from him. His opponent knew he had the Byakugan. He couldn't be planning on using a smokescreen unless he was an idiot. Speaking of which, Neji noticed the absence of the fifth Naruto just a little bit too late as said original burst out of the ground underneath his feet, catching the boy in a solid uppercut that was enough to launch him a few feet backwards. Naruto stood over Neji's crumpled body, checking him over to see if he really was out or he was just faking. Deciding that the boy really was unfit to continue, he nodded with a smile before allowing the proctor to approach and announce him the victor. There was a momentary silence from the crowd as they stared down at the blonde-haired winner before it erupted into cheers. Naruto basked in the praise for a few seconds but didn't let it get to his head. He also managed to hear more than a few groans as people ripped up the betting tickets. It would appear he was not the favorite for this particular match. That just widened his smile. Sometimes it was good to be the victorious underdog. It made the achievement feel that much better. Maintaining his satisfied smile, he shunshined out of the arena into the competitor's box just for that added flair and allowed the next opponents to begin. Wow, I can't believe your teammate beat Neji. Tayuya cringed at the sickly sweet but familiar voice. She shrank into the seat hoping that for some reason Gaara was nearby and that was who Ino was talking to. She was proved wrong when the blonde sat down next to her, followed by the pink-haired girl who was part of their amusing double co. He was the rookie of the year last year. Everybody thought he was going to win this. Tayuya smirked at that. Even if Naruto hadn't won, Gaara would have wiped the floor with the Hyuga prodigy. Don't be stupid, Ino pig. Sasuke will easily win this. Tayuya tried to inch away from the two girls as they argued, hoping that they would forget she was here. I don't know, forehead, that Naruto guy looks pretty strong. Tayuya chuckled at the nickname, only now noticing the rather large forehead of the bubblegum kunoiki. It proved to be her downfall as the noise alerted the two arguing ninja of her presence once again. The pink-haired one that for now Tayuya would call bubblegum started to look her over critically. It made her really uncomfortable. Hey, why don't you have anything on your forehead protector? Aren't you from the village hidden in the sand? Tayuya groaned, looking for an escape from the boring and pointless conversation. She wished she could go to the competitor's box but she wasn't allowed. Instead she just elected to completely ignore the two girls. It didn't work last time but she held out hope. Shut up, forehead, she's probably worried about her boyfriend. He took a bit of a beating from Neji after all. Tayuya had to try really hard not to respond to the obvious attempt at getting her riled up. Even so, she felt her eye begin to twitch out of annoyance and bit back the urge to bring out her flute. Must not kill Konoha kunoiki, must not kill allies, must not kill Konoha kunoiki. Naruto appeared in the box to a fairly amusing sight. Gaara was staring at Shino and Shino was staring right back. The two stoic boys just looked at one another. Gaara's gaze was as unblinking as Shino's shaded glasses made him out to be. It was the most intense staring contest Naruto had ever seen and he was just captivated by it. However, considering that Shino was next, he decided to interrupt and coughed loud enough for both the quiet ninja to hear. Shino turned to him and nodded in acknowledgement before he disappeared in a cloud of bugs, reappearing on the arena floor a few seconds later. Gaara just stayed quiet as Naruto walked over, a confused but bemused expression on his face as he looked at his friend. The two stood there side by side for a few moments, watching as Dosu also made his way down to the arena. I like him. Naruto smirked at his friend's comment but refocused his attention to where the two new opponents were seemingly arguing. I said I forfeit. For the briefest of moments Shino let out a rather annoyed scowl. One wouldn't have seen it unless you looked for it. Hey, just narrowed his eyes at the sound ninja, annoyed by this sudden turn of events. Are you sure about this? Once you forfeit you cannot re-enter the competition. Dosu merely nodded, his one visible eye warily watching Shino's silent and passive form. Yeah, you heard me. I'm not fighting that bug freak after what he did to Zaku. Because of his mirrored glasses, Dosu missed the evil look Shino was giving him, not that he would have wanted to notice anyway. Hey just rubbed the back of his head, coughing into his hand a little, unsure about what to do. Well, okay then. Dosu has forfeited. Would the next two competitors please come to the arena? He followed the shout with a rather unhealthy bout of coughing into his hand. That in turn was followed by protests and booing from the audience. Naruto watched as Shikamaru lazily got up from his position on the floor of the box. He walked over to the edge of the viewing area, looking like he was also considering forfeiting, however for different reasons. This is such a drag. Lee suddenly popped up behind him, his eyes almost flaming with excitement. Come my youthful opponent, now is the time we must fight. With that Lee patted Shikamaru a little hard on the back, too hard as he quickly stumbled forward to land painfully on his face down on the arena floor. By the time he had picked himself up, Lee had already run down the side of the arena, happily hopping up and down in the middle of the stadium in anticipation. Shikamaru groaned again, grumbling more unintelligible complaints as he, very slowly, made his way towards where Lee and Hayat stood waiting. Both Genin waited for the proctor to begin the match. Lee was still bouncing and Shikamaru was much more calm and collected. His hands naturally found their way together, so his thumbs and index fingers made a circle between his hands. He was only now starting to regret not planning this match out in advance, but at the time he found it too troublesome. He began to run through scenarios in his mind, but always came back to the same idea based on what he knew about Lee. It didn't exactly look good for him. Shikamaru would be the first to say that he wasn't good in solo fights, despite what happened in the preliminaries. He had merely been lucky in his circumstances and surroundings, not that it wasn't him who took those things into account and used them. Lee was exactly the opposite, practically built for solo matches thanks to his extraordinarily trained body and lightning-fast reflexes. Shikamaru wouldn't be like that until he began learning the rest of his family jutsus. He could have already, but he much preferred to just lie back and watch the clouds. He did that as he waited, leaned his head back and just chose a cloud, watching the white puffy accumulation of condensed water float lazily across the sky. It would be magnificent if he could be one, without a care in the world, just floating along without problems or troubles. His trouble for the moment was more focused on the larger version of himself in the crowd, thinking on how he would make his sensei proud in this match. Both teens were distracted when Hayat finally jumped back, so for a few seconds neither did anything, both lost in their own little world. Surprisingly, it was Shikamaru who realized the match had started first and immediately used his family's most recognizable jutsu. Shadow Possession Jutsu. Lee heard the shout in time to instinctively jump backwards, a surprising distance too. He landed well out of range of Shikamaru's elongated shadow, watching it carefully. He had seen it in the preliminaries, so he knew not to come too close. This of course posed a massive problem in that his fighting style solely consisted of up-close and personal taijutsu attacks. If he couldn't even get near Shikamaru, then all of that was completely useless. Without anything else to do, the two opponents were at an impasse. Shikamaru couldn't move closer to Lee or he would be out of the extending affect of the wall's shadow, and Lee couldn't get close to Shikamaru, period. Both Genin contemplate their options, and eventually it was Lee who came to a conclusion first. He would just have to be faster than the shadow. With that he launched himself forward, weaving and ducking randomly in an attempt to confuse Shikamaru. Luckily for the young tactician, he had already considered his opponent's brash nature before he had even thought about making the attack. He withheld using his shadow until the last safe moment before unleashing it in one go. 5 feet away from Shikamaru, Lee froze in place, uncomfortably settling into the same slouching position as the lazy Nara. Shikamaru just smiled, already reaching for his shuriken pouch. Lee did the same, but there was no pouch where he was reaching for. Shikamaru lazily brought several of the shuriken out and stretched his arm back ready to throw them. He only intended to disable Lee, so he lowered his aim for the boy's legs using the fluorescent orange leg warmers as a target. He let loose the spiraling metal with Lee copying the phantom motions, and each one struck Lee's legs precisely. However, the smile that had graced the normally apathetic boy's features dropped when the shuriken merely ricocheted off the leg warmers with a metallic clang. A few tense seconds later and the leg warmers fluttered to the floor, ripped clean off, revealing what they hid beneath. The 2 large ankle weights, which had likewise been severed, soon followed, making a very noticeable crater in the ground as they slid off Lee's legs. The ever-excitable Rock Lee let out the largest smile imaginable, and suddenly Shikamaru felt his hold on the jutsu weaken. Everybody in the stadium, Nara clan especially, gawked as Lee first took one step forward, followed by another. Shikamaru couldn't believe what he was seeing. There was just no way anybody could be that strong. Even so, the rivulets of sweat lazily making their way down his face told him otherwise as he struggled to maintain the exhaustive jutsu. His mind was in overdrive, trying to come up with a solution to this new problem that he had not foreseen. Even as he thought, Lee was still making steady progress towards him, also sweating from the sheer exertion the simple act of walking put him through. As Lee approached, Shikamaru saw only one viable option left. He let Lee get a little closer, now no further than arm's length away, before lifting himself up and firmly smacking his head into Lee's. The two genin just stared at nothing for a moment before they both lost the grip on gravity and fell to the ground, unconscious. Hayat jogged over, checking to see if either had managed to avoid falling asleep from the blow. He approached, only for Lee to suddenly shoot to his feet, already in a fighting stance. Anybody that knew Lee wouldn't have found that odd. What they would have, however, was the fact that Lee was still completely unconscious. He swayed back and forth on his feet, but his eyes were firmly shut and he was mumbling under his breath like a sleep talker. Hayat wasn't sure what to make of the situation. Technically it was a double knockout, but Lee was on his feet and apparently ready to fight. He narrowed his eyes for a moment before withdrawing a shuriken and throwing it so it would pass close to Lee's head. The young taijutsu master deftly caught the projectile, still fully asleep. Hayat guessed that made him still combat ready and quickly announced the match in Lee's favor. His sensei came down to carry both boys to the competitors' box as the entire arena fell deathly quiet. Naruto noticed the shift in atmosphere and looked around the stadium curiously, wondering why everybody now expectantly looked towards the competitor box. Gaara just walked off down the halls to the stairway leading down to the arena floor. That was when Naruto noticed the distinct lack of a certain red-eyed Uchiha, despite it being his match. He wondered where the boy could be. Why would you be late for something like this? Meanwhile, Gaara stood calmly in his required spot, patiently awaiting the arrival of his opponent. Nervous whispers began to circulate in the stands as after 2 minutes Sasuke had still failed to show up. Gaara wasn't worried. He could wait for as long as was needed. 5 minutes after the match was supposed to start and people were now really beginning to worry, it would appear that this was the match everybody had been waiting for and the main competitor wasn't even there. Hey, where's Duckbutt? Tayuya looked across at Ino and Sakura, both of whom were sporting the same worried and nervous looks that the rest of the betting audience were. Ino turned, scowling at the redhead while Sakura just looked confused. What do you mean, Duckbutt? Ino doubled the ferocity of her gaze, which Tayuya only found amusing. You know, SA's gay. It took her a moment, but Sakura finally caught on, and immediately joined Ino in trying to burn a hole through her skull through the power of the combined will. Don't call Sasuke-kun that. Tayuya took on an exaggerated mock-apologetic look with a hand on her chest. Oh, I'm sorry I insulted your precious Sasuke-kun. She made sure to say it in as sweet and innocent a voice as possible, which only made it sound even less sincere. I guess I'd be pretty scared if I had to fight Gaara as well. The other two kunoiki still seemed mad, but the previous worry seemed to be overtaking them again. Sasuke will easily beat that sand guy. Ino nodded after her friend, but it didn't look all that sure. Tayuya just smirked, amazed at how easily the tables turned and she was the annoyer. Sure. After 10 minutes the Hokage was forced to make a decision concerning Sasuke's possible disqualification for failure to show up. Luckily for the last Uchiha and all those betting in his favor, he appeared alongside Kakashi, who rubbed the back of his head rather apologetically. After a brief conversation with an annoyed Hayat to see if they could still participate, the Junin retired and Sasuke took up his stance, ready to fight. Sasuke eyed Gaara with caution. Having seen what he did to Tenten in the preliminaries, he felt prepared but not overconfident. Gaara on the other hand looked at the Uchiha with nothing more than indifference, choosing to actually sit down on the floor of the arena. Sasuke looked extremely angry with that. He had seen Gaara's sand defense before, but he didn't think the boy would actually be this cocky about it. Gaara maintained his cross-legged stance even when Hayat started the match. Immediately Sasuke rushed forward, throwing kick after kick at Gaara, only for his sand to spring up and block it every time. Gaara literally could have stayed there all night just waiting for the Uchiha to tire himself out attempting to breach his sand. As it was, he was actually a little annoyed by how late Sasuke had turned up to the fight, even if he didn't show it. He started bringing more sand out of the gourd to complement what was already being used to block Sasuke's every attack. It started to circle him in a loose ring before expanding, slowly forming into a perfect sphere around him. Sasuke continued to attack the outside of the rock-hard sphere, searching for any weakness in the sand he could find. Soon the sphere began to expand, moving outwards as a dome that grew in circumference. Now every time Sasuke attacked, a spike would appear seconds after his foot connected with the dome. Only his reflexes saved his foot from being impaled and cost him the match. He began growing desperate as the sand continued to grow, now pulling the minerals out of the ground itself to feed it. He retreated up the wall of the stadium for some respite, noting that the dome continued to grow even in his absence, slowly approaching the wall of the stadium. He narrowed his eye at the clever tactic. If he allowed the dome to continue growing, he would be crushed against the stadium wall. If he tried to land on top of it, his feet would only get caught, and if he fled the arena, the match would be forfeit. He had hoped he wouldn't have to use this so early, but with gritted teeth he began to slowly draw chakra into his hand. Soon it crackled around his hand as lightning, splitting the air with distinctive bird-like chirps. Chidori. He took a deep breath before taking off from the wall at a sprint, rushing down while leaving rubble in his wake from the speed and the barely constrained attack. As he approached the dome, which would soon reach the boundaries of the arena, he jumped into the air and in an obviously copied way he used the Inuzuka attack to spin wildly. Chidori held out in front of him. The drill-like attack worked and he quickly broke through the normally impenetrable sand to land with a cocky smile inside. The smile fell off his face as he realized there was nobody inside the dome. It was conspicuously empty. The hole he had created ominously closed behind him before the dome began to retreat in on itself. Sasuke realized his mistake too late as the dome collapsed back into a sphere, him held hostage inside. There wasn't enough room for a Chidori and all he could do was back into the center, awaiting the completion of his capture. A minute later and he was perfectly held within the sphere, floating a few feet from the ground and curled up into a ball to prevent any bones from being broken. Gaara could have crushed him if he wanted, but he left it like that. Everybody in the stadium watched slack-jawed as Gaara defeated the last Uchiha, held like an animal in a cage. Hayate announced Gaara the winner and he immediately dispersed the sand. Sasuke dropped to the floor in an ungraceful heap. One sand shunshin later and Naruto was slapping Gaara on the back, congratulating him and mentally grinning at the humiliating way he had beaten Sasuke. He didn't have long, however, as before long he had to go back down into the arena to begin the second round of the finals. He looked over at Shino, who calmly looked back. Both nodded before making their way back down. By the time Naruto had made it onto the arena floor, the crowds had died down to a dissatisfied but dull roar. He could tell that there were still many people irritated by Sasuke's loss. He briefly wondered what that might mean for the last Uchiha, but he put it out of his mind. Instead, he decided to size up his opponent across from him. He reminded Naruto so much of Gaara. It was the way he stood, stoic and silent, yet definitely confident in his abilities. Naruto felt he had every reason to be. The Aburame clan's specialty was certainly impressive, if just slightly weird. He wondered how they were actually able to carry chakra-eating bugs inside their own bodies without dying. He was pondering whether or not it was some kind of summoning contract and the implications of that when Hayate finally began the match. Luckily, the majority of Naruto's strategy for this match was staying stationary, so he didn't need to move. Shino was like Gaara in combat as well, staying still while his bugs took care of all the actual fighting. Naruto saw those same bugs quickly emerge from Shino, no doubt expecting Naruto to immediately rush into combat. He supposed he could have done that, but it would have defeated the purpose of his next item on the Chunin checklist, patience. Naruto merely observed as an entire swarm of the little chakra suckers poured out of the unmoving boy. He was quickly surrounded on all sides in a small oasis of land that wasn't covered by the Kikaichu, neither combatant having made a single move yet. You were foolish to allow yourself to be surrounded like that. The Kikaichu will slowly drain your body of chakra until there is none left to take. You should forfeit now, save yourself the pain. Naruto just nodded with a smile on his face, taking the stoic Aburame by surprise slightly as the bug user wondered what he was planning. Thanks for the warning, I just wanted to test your bugs, see how fast they really can drain chakra. In honesty, Naruto was already beginning to feel the effects. Chakra was slowly being sucked from his body, seemingly through the air itself, though much less than they could have if they were directly on him. He fought back the urge to drop down on one knee. The effects were truly exhausting, but he managed to maintain his posture and even crossed his arms a little, acting bored. The crowd was confused. After Naruto's last fight, they had at least expected some action or a good show. Instead, both boys were merely standing there. To make it even worse, Naruto appeared to be allowing himself to lose, letting his energy be siphoned off into the Kikaichu. Shino didn't show it, but he was both surprised and impressed. His bugs were working at full capacity and Naruto was still standing. That alone was a feat in of itself, and Shino could at least commemorate him. Nobody had lasted this long before. However, that begrudging respect quickly tuned to worry as a minute went by and Naruto showed no visible signs of fatigue. He hadn't moved a muscle once except to reposition himself and was now lazily looking around the stadium. That worry increased tenfold when he realized that many of his Kikaichu had begun returning to his body, unable to absorb any more chakra from Naruto. In essence, they got full from eating his chakra. To say that Shino was surprised would be one hell of an understatement. That had definitely never happened before. How are you doing this? Nobody has this much chakra. Naruto finally acknowledged the aberrame, turning to face him with a large smile. Oh good, then at least it's working. Honestly, you had me a little worried there for a while. I thought I had misjudged how much your bugs could ingest. At this point Naruto began noticing that the ring of insects surrounding him has gotten smaller and was still decreasing as more and more flew back to their host. When about half of them were gone, Naruto began walking, slowly at first but increasing his speed. The Kikaichu moved to intercept him, but they were sluggish and weighed down by their exhaustive meal. He easily dodged the lazy attack and was quickly approaching a startled and unprepared Shino who could only watch as Naruto moved closer. He couldn't form a bug clone quick enough, so he dropped into his family's taijutsu stance. He was uncertain about the outcome of this match now, as Naruto had kept up with Neji, so he would easily deal with the aberrame's less developed taijutsu. However, the bug wielder was surprised when Naruto merely stopped a few feet away from him, not bothering to attack. He quickly understood why when he felt the cold steel of a kunai press up against his neck. He could only turn enough to see a smiling Naruto behind him, holding said kunai with the intent to use it if Shino moved an inch. At least tell me how. Naruto pondered the request for a moment and nodded curtly. Okay. I knew I might be facing you, so for the entire month we had to prepare. I started sealing as much of my chakra as I could into temporary seals across my body. All I did in this match was release them when I started to feel your Kikaichu feed of me. They fed on my old chakra and I held onto my own. He smiled all the way through the explanation, and Shino had to admit it was incredibly smart, pointing out a large flaw in the aberrame's attack plan. However, he felt secure in the knowledge that Naruto was only able to pull off the feat thanks to having the appropriate knowledge beforehand. There was nobody on Earth with that much chakra to attempt this unprepared, but even so Shino would definitely be having a discussion with his father about this later. Thank you for showing me a flaw in my strategy. Naruto nodded politely again as Shino raised his arm to signal he was forfeiting the match. Once again the crowd seemed dissatisfied with the outcome, nothing exciting happening at all. The Aberrame clan, however, had watched riveted to the entire display. They were equally as intrigued as Shino was by Naruto's foreplanning, and even the clan head had to commend the young genin's strategy. Naruto, on the other hand, was pretty pleased with himself. Shino didn't seem that bad, so it was nice that he didn't have to hurt him. He saw what Gaara meant when the stoic sand wielder showed his like for him. They walked out of the stadium together, Naruto towards the competitor's box now that he was guaranteed a place in the finals, and Shino towards his family in the stands. As they did so, Gaara once again entered the arena, Lee matching his Shunshin with an overexcited sprint to win. They managed to arrive at the same moment, much to many people's shock that Lee could actually beat a Shunshin just by running. If Gaara was also impressed, he certainly didn't show it. He merely began drawing out sand from the gourd, already preparing himself for the same maneuver that defeated Sasuke. He figured that if it worked, then there was no use in trying something else. Lee was also preparing in his own way by removing his ankle weights early. He had asked Guy earlier and was given full permission. When both genin appeared ready, Head jumped backwards, very far backwards if this fight would be anything like Gaara's last one. Instantly Gaara was preparing the dome of sand, however he wasn't expecting the sheer speed that Lee now possessed without his ankle weights. In a literal flash of movement, Lee disappeared, reappearing almost instantly at Gaara's side, much to the Ichibi Jinchuriki's shock. One hard and swift kick later, Gaara found himself hurtling backwards out of the protective influence of his sand. The gourd on his back broke down just in time to cushion his otherwise painful fall. Even so, he managed to leave a small trench due to the sheer velocity the kick managed to send him. Before he could even stand up, he felt Lee's foot connect again, flicking him up into the air quite violently. It didn't stop there. Somehow the taijutsu prodigy managed to launch kick after bone-breaking kick at Gaara, obviously springing back off the floor each time just to reconnect with Gaara's body. It was all happening far too fast for Gaara to properly process what was happening. Once he was high enough into the air, namely level with the actual stands, Lee had wrapped him up in bandages and they were already traveling down, spinning wildly like a miniature tornado. Front Lotus. The cry came out instants before both competitors drove harshly into the ground, Gaara head first with Lee using that to cushion his own fall. Lee backed away from the crater as the crowds of people looked on in wonder and shock. Once again there was the general moan of people who lost a lot of money betting on Gaara when the smoke cleared, revealing his motionless form. Lee made a gleaming smile as he looked up into the stands, to once again gain his sensei's approval. His celebration was cut short as a massive whip of sand slammed into his undefended side, sending him hurtling back across the stadium. The crowd's attention turned to Gaara once again, standing completely unharmed back where he had started the match. Those who hadn't been focused on Lee saw him rise up out of the ground, apparently having been there the entire time. The shell of a body that still remained in the crater slowly dissolved back into sand before rejoining the rest of it floating around Gaara. Now Gaara knew how fast Lee could travel. He wasn't going to allow the boy to get the upper hand again. He sent out tendril after tendril at the spandex-wearing boy, each one smashing into the ground with enough force to cause small tremors. He normally didn't let his emotions get the better of him in combat, but he was slightly angered that Lee's attack may well have hurt him had it not been a sand clone taking the beating. Lee on the other hand now found himself dodging left, right and center as arm-like constructs of sand filled his vision, drawing their form from the ground underneath him. He managed to dodge each one, but as they backed him into a corner he was finding it increasingly difficult. Soon that entire side of the stadium was covered in dust as Gaara kept up his relentless assault, determined to simply bat Lee out of the stadium itself, even if that meant through the floor. Finally he stopped, sensing no more movements behind the veil of dust and debris that was only now allowed to settle. Gaara stayed where he was, wary for any signs of movement inside the smothering cloud of smoke and dust. He didn't even look tired from the exertion of moving that volume of sand. In fact, his arms were still crossed over his chest. By the time his sand had fully retreated back to him, now forming a thin ring, which orbited him slowly, the dust had settled enough to see nothing. Lee was nowhere to be seen in that side of the arena. In fact, it appeared he had vanished completely from the stadium. Gaara cocked an eyebrow, curious as to where his opponent had vanished. So far Lee had shown no attempts at using ninjutsu or genjutsu, so it made a lot of people curious as to how he had simply vanished without a trace. Their questions were answered when everybody in the stadium simultaneously heard a distinctive whistling pierce through the eerie silence. Severe. A small black dot appeared over the stadium, rocketing down at tremendous speed. Leaf. That dot quickly resolved into Lee's spandex-coated form that now sported a fair few rips along its surface. Hurricane. Lee's body impacted with the stadium in an almighty crash, powerful enough to send an enormous blast of air into the stands. The ground around the impact zone rose up for a few seconds as the laws of displacement struggled to compensate for Lee's crash. It came back down as physics righted itself and a crater worthy of a meteorite was revealed from the dust and debris. In the center stood a panting Lee whose skin had inexplicably turned red and his eyes had lost their entire color. There was no sign of Gaara anywhere and Naruto worried for his friend's safety for a moment. It was premature however, as not too long after Gaara rose from the ground, the dust and dirt having covered him to the point of invisibility. He looked suitably shocked by the attack, his eyes were wide. The reason he had survived unscathed at all revealed itself when fragments of what appeared to be his skin dropped off of his body. The sand armor fell away from his body, his mind unable to hold it together as he reeled from the devastating attack. He was lucky that it took a few moments for the newly changed Lee to even realize he was still standing, enough time to right himself and begin pulling sand clones out of the ground. First 2, then 10, then 50 clones rose out of the ground. They were fed from the earth itself, even though it took a fair amount of Gaara's considerable reserves to manage. By now Lee had figured out his attack had failed and went about the newly reconfigured stadium, making short work of all Gaara's clones. Each was swiftly removed from existence as he blurred about the stadium like he had no mass whatsoever. However many he destroyed, though, Gaara would just create more. They didn't actually do anything though, merely standing around just waiting to be pulverized by Lee's strong fist style. Gaara used them as a distraction to retreat from Lee's unimaginably fast form and start to concentrate for what he needed to do. Anybody watching him, and a fair few people were by now considering Lee was moving too fast to be seen by the naked eye, would have seen his sand begin to drain into the earth. He closed his eyes, feeling the vibrations in the earth that Lee was making through the tiny streams of sand beneath the surface of the ground. Taking a large breath in to steady his nerves and concentrations, Gaara took on an extremely focused look. Imperial Sand Net. Before the last word was even out of his mouth, thousands of strings or sand burst out of every corner of the stadium, crossing over one another until razor-sharp lines of sand crisscrossed every meter of the arena. Lee was stopped in his tracks. He couldn't even move a muscle or risk slicing himself into pieces. Lee actually smiled when he realized the only part of his body that he could even move was his arm so that he could forfeit. He did so quickly before Gaara decided to actually complete the lethal jutsu, and all the sand immediately dispersed back into particles. The crowd was left stunned and speechless at the display of sheer power each combatant had given. Naruto too was shocked. He had realized Gaara had been working on something for the past month, but he never would have suspected something of this caliber. With a gulp, he contemplated what other attacks his friend might be withholding from him in preparation for their fight. With another gulp, he realized that moment had in fact just arrived as Lee was walked out of the arena by his sensei. With a breath to calm himself and a moment to plaster a smile across his features, he jumped out of the box and joined Gaara on the arena floor. He looked across at his oldest friend and thought back to all the times they sparred in the past. Something told him this would be quite on the same level. As they both eyed each other up, the tension in the stadium was palpable. Many preconceived notions about how this Chunin exam finals had been completely and irrevocably destroyed. The odds were swinging in both directions with no clear favorite, although after the last fight there were a few more opting for Gaara. They were given a brief 5-minute interlude for Gaara to regain his lost chakra, but Shukaku was already taking care of that. Both boys smirked as they looked out at one another, even they didn't know how this fight would turn out. They had been fighting one another since they were 8 years old. When one got the upper hand, the other would just improvise and turn the tables. Naruto produces a set of lengthened kunai from his sleeves, infusing each blade with a fair amount of wind chakra. One was held out in front of him in a guard position while the other was behind him, held in a reverse grip for speed. He considered bringing out his favorite technique, but again he didn't want to use it in front of all these people. There would be far too many questions later on. He opted for a few oldies that might catch Gaara off guard. Nobody knew Subaku no Gaara like Naruto. That's why he knew Lee almost had the right idea. Rushing Gaara was a good ploy. Getting in close was where he was weakest. The problem lay in knowing if you were fighting Gaara at all. Naruto was dropping into a very low crouch that would aid him getting that little extra burst of speed when the first feather fell from the sky. He watched it, completely mesmerized by the way its soft white form lazily drifted back and forth. A goofy smile split his face as his eyes moved back and forth, just watching the feather float in the breeze. It was completely out of his knowledge that there were hundreds more, identical to the one that so captured his attention, also falling from the sky. All around the stadium, the people who didn't recognize the genjutsu drifted off to sleep while the shinobi in the crowd started looking around for the cause of the mass illusion. They were only momentarily distracted by the massive burst of smoke from the Hokage's box before enemy shinobi began appearing out of the sleeping denizens of the crowd. Before anybody could react to the Hokage's danger, everybody found themselves fighting off hordes of enemy ninja, each proudly displaying their allegiances with musical notes on their headbands. Gaara was currently attempting to wake Naruto up from his genjutsu-induced lullaby as Tayuya joined them, having jumped down from the stands. One burst of chakra later and Naruto was up, his eyes opened wide from the shock-like nature of being ripped from a genjutsu. He looked around in a semi-daze, confused as to what exactly was going on. However, he saw Konoha ninja fighting Sound Ninja, and that was all the knowledge he needed. He was about to rush off to help when he noticed the enormous purple box that had erupted in the Hokage's box. Fearing for the old man's safety, he took off at pace, leaping and dodging past dueling shinobi. He was running like a dog, on all fours, using his claws to dig into the earth and propel himself even faster. Gaara and Tayuya were having trouble keeping up and only managed to do so thanks to Naruto stopping on top of the roof where 3 Anbu stood watching the fight develop inside the translucent barrier. What's happening? One of the Anbu turned to them. He was wearing a mask that gave him the appearance of a rat. The Hokage is currently engaging in combat with the Sannin Orochimaru behind this barrier. We are unable to breach it and must trust that our Hokage can handle the situation. Naruto cursed under his breath. He knew some Fuinjutsu but would never declare himself a master. If the Anbu could do nothing, then he stood no hope of helping. We were instructed by the Sand Village to offer our aid in the case of emergency. The Anbu looked over the three, his eyes narrowing underneath his mask in suspicion. However, right now they couldn't afford to be picky with their help, and he quickly nodded. Fine. There is nothing you can do here. Go help the other shinobi repel the sound ninja attacking from the outside. Naruto nodded back, his face now set in a determined grimace as the three set off in the direction the most noise and smoke was coming from. Naruto looked back in time to see Sarutobi going toe-to-toe with Orochimaru. Come on, old man, I know you can beat him. That was all Naruto had time for as they rounded the corner of the street and entered a war zone. Naruto dodged another punch from an older sound ninja, ducking under the rather sloppy blow as he grabbed the man's sleeve and used his momentum to launch him into a nearby wall. He raced after him before the man had even made contact and pulled him out of the miniature crater. He threw him again, this time with more force towards another approaching shinobi, who took the blow full in the chest. Naruto swiftly moved on, finding more free opponents in the mess that were the streets close to the wall. He swerved in a panic as masonry and rubble suddenly fell from the sky around him, forcing him to weave and duck or be crushed underneath. He turned to see the cause of the potentially fatal destruction, to see the biggest snake he had ever seen. The worst part was that its dull, lifeless eyes were staring right back at him as its tongue flicked out of its mouth once. Oh crap. Gaara felt more like he was sweeping a room free of dust than fighting of deadly attempts on his life. His sand swept through the unsuspecting and ill-prepared hordes of enemy ninja, suffocating and beating them into unconsciousness without any real effort on his part. Kunai and Shuriken flew in every direction, always being intercepted by his automatic defense before it could come close to causing him harm. His difficulty was discerning friend from foe. Sometimes it was difficult to fine-tune his control to just the sound shinobi when everywhere was so densely packed. He had to consciously control his chakra-laced sand so it would only attack his enemies. Right now he was calmly walking through the brawling masses, creating his own eye of the hurricane in a few feet around him in every direction. Nobody could even get close. Inside that little bubble of protection were a few children, between the ages of 6 and 9. They were kids who hadn't had time to be evacuated, and currently Gaara's sand was protecting them like they were the Jinchuriki themselves. He was walking them through the battle in the direction of the closest concentration of Konoha shinobi who could lead them to the safety of the bunkers. It had started with one kid who had seen how he was protected, and before he knew it there were almost 15 of them, all huddled around his body in fear. Tayuya was having the most fun of the three, dancing through the battle like a merry Pied Piper. Her fingers raced across her flute like they were possessed, weaving more and more intricate genjutsus that served to confuse, disorientate and generally slow down the enemy. Currently she had a group of sound nin fighting among one another, half of them thinking the other were the enemy. Anybody that came across her quickly believed that their flesh was melting right off their body or that the ground itself was swallowing them alive. Powerful shinobi would come into her vision only to leave it as cowering balls of tears that were easy pickings for the Konoha shinobi. Like the Pied Piper, she had managed to assemble a group of the Konoha genin, namely Shino, Lee, and Tenten. They managed to deal with anybody intelligent or strong enough to break out of her genjutsus quickly enough. They worked well as a cohesive unit, dealing with stragglers that Tayuya left behind while protecting the girl herself. Tayuya had previously been annoyed with Lee for her rather humiliating defeat at his hands. That quickly bled away when the boy managed to save her from a very large sound ninja who had rushed her blind spot with a kunai poised for the kill. Lee had jumped in and managed to swiftly take out the man, all as Tayuya watched on, unable to do anything while her hands, or more specifically her fingers, were busy. Naruto cringed back into himself as he looked around his dark, fleshy prison. He shuddered at the feel of the slimy substance that coated everything and did everything in his power to not allow it to get in his mouth. It wasn't working. He struggled about as he thought about just how the hell he had managed to get eaten by a snake the size of a building. This is not how I am going to die. I am not going to be some snake's lunch. He slashed about with the wind chakra-infused kunai only for the rubbery walls to wobble when he struck them. He couldn't get enough leverage behind the blows to do any real damage, and when he did, all he got for his troubles was some blood sprayed in his face. It was hot and sticky and made the blonde want to throw up, but he persevered. It still had no effect, and he could feel himself get drawn even further into the fleshy tunnel. Right now he was just glad that snakes ate their meals whole. Right, that's it. Multi-shadow CLO blue. Even as the jutsu took effect, more of the gunk managed to get in his mouth. From the outside, the shinobi battling the vast snake only saw it pause for a moment before its body began to writhe uncontrollably. One part of its long scaly body expanded suddenly, giving way to hundreds upon hundreds of Naruto clones as its body exploded from the sheer number of them. Snake blood and guts rained down on the battlefield, covering Konoha and sound shinobi indiscriminately. The hundreds of Naruto clones puffed out of existence as the original was finally allowed to fall over on his hands and knees, as he voided the contents of his stomach in a violent manner. Every fighting shinobi felt it as the general retreat was called while Orochimaru was seen fleeing the site of his battle, now a veritable forest atop the roof. The sound shinobi all retreated as one, still being cut down or captured by the Leaf Nin as they attempted their hasty escape. Naruto didn't bother to run after them, leaving it up to the Konoha ninja, which he realized, had been rather severely reduced in number. Instead he began making his way back through the battlefields looking for any signs of his teammates. He spotted Tayuya first, her vibrant red hair easy to pick out from the surrounding masses. She quickly helped him locate Gaara, still managing to have a few wayward children cling to him that felt safer with the Sandman than in the shelters. Naruto held back his laugh for their sake, but he would definitely note that down for later. They had to make jokes, what they had seen was gruesome, and if this was how they coped with it, then all the better. Dead shinobi littered the street from Otogakure and Konohagakure alike. The Shinigami held no preferences or reservations. They searched through the damaged streets some more, helping to find injured or stranded ninja and civilians. Naruto still couldn't believe the paths of destruction the massive snakes had carved through the village. Entire lines of houses and shops were flattened, reduced to barely rubble and dust. The walls didn't look that much better, gaping holes littered the once mighty and impenetrable wall, and in some areas it was still crumbling. Hyugas picked through the rubble, using their Kekkei Genkai to locate anybody still alive or trapped in wrecked homes or storefronts. While in the heat of battle, Naruto had barely noticed all the destruction, but now that it was all over, there was nothing else to look at. It was a relief for everybody when night finally came. After many showers, Naruto finally crawled into bed. The Inuzuka compound managed to come out of the ordeal fairly unscathed thanks to its out-of-the-way location. He wrapped his arm around Tayuya's waist more tightly than usual, unintentionally using her as a comfort. He felt her slight shivers. Despite the tough facade she put up, he knew she had seen more than her fair share of bloodshed and death today. Despite his or her careers, seeing somebody die in front of you, enemy or friend alike, never got any easier. Before he finally allowed himself the embrace of sleep, he let out one last fleeting thought for the friends he had made in his brief stay in the village. He hoped they were okay, but right now it was most important that the girl he was clutching was still there. He didn't know what he would do if Tayuya were ever hurt, or worse, killed. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.